What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Thomas, bringing you another edition of the Thomas Take. Today, big news inside the world of mixed martial arts as Gegard Mousasi signs a 6-fight deal. Not with the UFC. He chooses greener pastures in Bellator MMA, another signing by the second largest promotion inside the world of mixed martial arts. Bellator MMA plucking another fighter from the UFC ranks. And this isn't just any other fighter, people. This is a top 5 UFC MMA middleweight defecting from the UFC and heading to Bellator, reuniting with his former boss from back in the Strikeforce days, Scott Coker, the now president of Bellator MMA. Really, as I stated over a year ago, the direction of Bellator MMA changed in so many ways when they went from Bjorn Rebney to Scott Coker. He has done a fantastic job building the promotion up from really little to nothing in terms of roster talent and depth in each division inside the Bellator MMA organization. Guys like Rory McDonald, guys like Gegard Mousasi, Phil Davis, Ryan Bader, just to name a few, Chael Sonnen, Vanderlei Silva, Fedor Emelianenko, Matt Mitrione, Roy Nelson. He's brought over a lot of big names, people that have a lot of impact, that have made an impact on the sport of MMA. Tito Ortiz, Quentin Jackson. There's been a lot, and some might not be in the prime of their career, but obviously 3 premium additions to the Bellator MMA roster were Rory McDonald, Ryan Bader, Phil Davis, but you can add a 4th, Gegard Mousasi, to that list. And realistically, the options are there for Gegard Mousasi to really come into Bellator MMA and really make some big fights. I expect him to take on the middleweight champion of Bellator MMA. I expect him to eventually, a fight that I am really excited for is the possibility, and it's a fight that really popped into my head as soon as I had, I had obviously heard that there were rumblings of Mousasi possibly going to Bellator MMA, but I didn't really think that, I didn't really know. No one really had any real track on the Mousasi news. It was kind of up in the air, but a fight that would really interest me for all intents and purposes, and I think that it's a fight that will happen, and the way it will happen will be huge for Bellator MMA, and that is a Rory McDonald versus Gegard Mousasi fight. Now, I want to mention this now so I can be ahead of the curve a little bit here, pat myself on the back, and say, yeah, I mentioned this fight before anybody else started talking about it. Rory McDonald versus Gegard Mousasi, realistically at 185, a champion versus champion fight. I expect Rory McDonald to win the Bellator welterweight title. I expect Gegard Mousasi to win the Bellator middleweight title. And before I, botch their names, I want to preface my statement by saying that that's quite possible. Rafael Carvalho, the Bellator middleweight champion, and obviously the welterweight champion Douglas Lima, who defended his belt versus Lorenz Larkin at Bellator NYC. I really have high expectations for the Lima-McDonald fight. I think McDonald will win the title in that fight, and I think Mousasi will beat Cavalcante, which would set up a huge, huge match, huge fight between Mousasi and Rory McDonald, 2 fighters that defected from the UFC, 2 fighters that kind of got away from the UFC, that most inside the world of MMA, media members, people like myself that broadcast on public airwaves, really thought that was 2 huge losses. I really thought that Rory was a big loss for the UFC, and I think that Mousasi will prove to be a big loss for the UFC. The UFC middleweight division, outside of the newly minted interim champion Robert Whittaker, is full of fighters that are somewhat past their prime. Michael Bisping, the champion of that division, but he's definitely not going to be fighting much longer. Even with a victory over Whittaker at some point at the end of the year, I only expect maybe one more fight from Bisping, as he even said so himself. Yoel Romero, who fought Whittaker this past weekend, he is of age He is 40 years of age, I should say. And he looked like he was very long in the tooth in his performance versus Robert Whittaker. Jacare Souza is a little bit long in the tooth as well. Anderson Silva still fighting in the UFC middleweight division. Really outside of Luke Rockhold and Chris Weidman, there's not much, and we've seen that message kind of play itself out. So Mousasi kind of provided the UFC with a little bit of a fresh breath of air, and now that he's gone, very, very curious move by the UFC. And also, Mousasi was on the MMA Hour today with one of my favorite people inside the world of MMA, Ariel Helwani, and he talked about how basically he chose the UFC chose Bellator over the UFC, due to large part of the fact that sponsorship, it's a theme that I have just hammered down. Sponsorship has been a huge reason why most fighters have defected from the UFC to Bellator, and the Reebok deal especially was a deal that Mousasi labeled as the $4 billion sale deal, which basically alluding to the fact that Reebok was what helped WME IMG buy the UFC for $4.25 billion. And I never really saw it that way, that the UFC would bring in Reebok only to kind of give themselves more of a NFL feel for a talent agency like WME IMG to really hone in on them. And that was a smart way of looking at it. I never even thought it that way. Couldn't really remember bits and pieces of the timeline of the situation, but very interesting words by Mousasi. Mousasi also stated that he would even consider taking fights at light heavyweight, also even heavyweight inside the Bellator cage. So this is what the situation is inside the sport of MMA. You're seeing more fighters choose to take the high-profile matchups as opposed to the title fights. The title fights in MMA are becoming a little bit, you have your John Jones, Daniel Cormiers of the world. You have your, Stipe Miocic versus, whoever his next opponent will be. You have those matchups. You have title fights that make sense, but you also have fighters that are choosing the legendary route. They want to pad their resume and continue to build the resume of their actual career over the long-term span of their career. We're going to see another fighter go from Bellator MMA to the UFC, and that fighter is Frank Mir. Frank Mir announced that he was released by the UFC after a long, long stint with the company. The most tenured UFC fighter, I think, of all time, if I'm not mistaken. And really, it was I don't want to say shocking, but I would say eye-opening, the fact that Frank Mir kind of dedicated a lot of his time inside the UFC cage, and realistically the UFC didn't really deem him worthy enough to be in the UFC heavyweight division, when realistically the UFC heavyweight division is probably the worst division in the UFC. The same old pickers. It's like the part in Walk the Line where Johnny Cash is bringing out the old band, and they're like, oh, you've got the same old pickers, and these guys, it's just not going to be entertaining. You got to go electric. Well, the UFC has just trotted out Johnny Cash and the Tennessee 2 over and over again, and realistically, it's getting very old. Alistair Overeem and Fabricio Verdum fighting for the third time this weekend in a co-main event. Alistair Overeem 37, Fabricio Verdum 39. When will the UFC bring in new heavyweight blood? I've begged for an Ultimate Fighter heavyweight season. We haven't seen a heavyweight season in the Ultimate Fighter since season 10 back in 2008 when Kimbo Slice was fighting Roy Nelson on Spike TV. We really, really need to see some sort of changing of the guard in terms of that UFC heavyweight division. The UFC is pushing Francis Ngannou in a fight with Junior Dos Santos coming up soon by the end of the summer, I believe. So realistically, let's make this division better and make it better. And Bellator has some of the same old pickers as well, but I would much rather watch Fedor Emelianenko take on Frank Mir than, let's just say, Alistair Overeem versus Cain Velasquez. I know how that fight will turn out. Both of those fighters are very injury-prone. Even with a win from Cain Velasquez, who the hell knows when Cain is going to fight again? And I love Cain Velasquez, but he just does not stay healthy. So realistically, it's very interesting to see how the tides are starting to change in terms of MMA free agency. We've seen Bellator make some big moves. You talk about where they were a year ago from now. I really threw down the hammer on Bellator on myfantasysportstalk.com. I talked about how Bellator was just a complete joke, and realistically they were, but over the last year, they have made some big additions, and they're really trying to build their brand. And Gegard Mousasi talked about that as well, talking about how he wants to help Bellator. And even lauding Scott Coker, saying, name one fighter that has said anything bad about Scott Coker. And guess what? I would have to agree. Scott Coker has a very good reputation inside the sport of MMA. He's been a matchmaker in MMA for over 25 years, dating back to the kickboxing days. He was a big kickboxing promoter around the world. So this guy is highly respected. The fighters appreciate him. He's a former mixed martial artist. So realistically, he has a common ground with the fighters already. So it works out really well for the future of the brand. I think that they're doing big things. I think eventually there will be an even playing field if things continue the way they are. If Dana White of the UFC president, if he continues to kind of bash fighters like the Amanda Nunes, like the Demetrius Johnson, of the world, those situations, I get it as a promoter, but on the other hand, as a promoter, I don't get it. Why bash your own product? That doesn't really make much sense to me. And I think that it's definitely not. It's not professional. It's not respectable. It's not classy. And so many fighters have had beefs with Dana White over the years that it begs the question. This is not just a coincidence anymore. This is real reality. They talk about Dana White as if he invented the sport of MMA. MMA has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, dating back to the ancient Greek days, the Roman Empire, dating all the way back in the history books. It just wasn't, what it is now. The world isn't, the world then wasn't what it is now. So when people give him so much credit for inventing the sport of MMA or saying that he made the sport of MMA what it is today, I can agree with that in some senses, but also I can't. So it's one of those things that you have him going around, parading around, blasting fighters, putting fighters on blast, basically saying that Chris Cyborg was a hermaphrodite, and then saying, Chris Cyborg's the greatest thing on the face of the earth. We were wrong on how we promote. No, nothing. You were wrong. The way you talked about her, the way you said that she was a man, things like that. That's not right. It's not cool. I don't respect that at all. And that stuff, as the days go by, while some people thought it was funny at the time, those things lead to other fighters wanting to leave the UFC for greener pastures inside the sport of MMA, inside Bellator MMA, and we will continue to see it. But this Mousasi addition to Bellator MMA is different. This is an addition where I think Mousasi would be willing to say more fighters should fight in Bellator, and it will actually have real, true, sincere meaning, being that he has the past that he has with Scott Coker dating back to the beginning of Strikeforce. That is my take on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Gegard Mousasi, the newest Bellator middleweight MMA fighter. Tune in for part 3. We'll be right back.